Monica, thank you so much for the really warm words of introduction and welcome to Virginia Tech. Also, many thanks to the whole student committee who decided to invite us here. It's such a pleasure and an honor to have arrived here. And of course, to the faculty and everybody that was involved in our presence. It's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak about our work. And so we're going to take you through a few of our projects that we've recently completed. But first, we wanted to start with kind of an opening story, or let's say a story of origin. So the year is 2009, and it's the Sharjah Biennale. Bram Koolhaas is giving a lecture and shows this image on the screen, which is a collage. It's not a real photograph, but it's a collage, kind of a mirage in the desert, exemplifying many kind of iconic tower projects of the recent past. And I think to us what it captures so well is this moment in the discipline where somehow architecture and its production was aligned to the production of iconography. It was aligned to capital in a way, the way that architecture and its form it kind of embodied capital or the pursuit of it. This was always kind of enabled by the computational tools at our disposal in the production of this iconographic form. And it was an interesting moment being 2009. Pablo, Juan and I were just in our first years of college, actually, and I think that image really came from this moment, which is the economic crisis of 2008, which had ripple effects all over the world, and for us, presented a kind of before and after. This moment of an economic crisis that had deep implications in the way that we were meant to understand architecture and its role within the world. If the image of Koolhaas is in a way poking a kind of irony at the role and the positioning of architecture up until that moment, perhaps this moment of crisis presents an interesting turning point for the discipline. How were we as students who had aspired to attend architecture school, to pursue that profession, imagining a certain kind of outcome or trajectory for our own careers, suddenly had to, in a way, reconfigure what that meant anyway, and how, what were our opportunities, how are we meant to perceive our role within the world. And I think that it also aligns well with projects such as these, which were the kind of landform buildings of the Audis that had a scale that attempted to be that of landscape. So vast in its requirement of resources, and in this case it's not just financial, but as you can see, the building of the City of Culture designed by Peter Eichelman on the outskirts of Santiago de Compostela, as almost desiring a project that desires to be a city in and of itself, and therefore requires a vast, expansive impact within networks of materials and processes that were required to bring projects like these of the mega scale that we have into fruition. And so I think these days we're not just confronted by a scenario of economic scarcity, that crisis I just described, but also an environmental one that has been with us for a really long time, but that is ever more present in our daily lives, and that we see it and sense it every day more acutely, how are we as architects meant to respond to these scenarios of economic, environmental, political, the health crisis that was brought about by the pandemic, and perhaps through that find a way to produce meaningful architecture. And we kind of came back to this really great diagram by John Habraken, who describes a kind of theory of supports, which basically means that there's time within architecture. That there are the supports, which are infrastructural, in a way indeterminate because of their kind of homogeneity. They're meant to recede, but also last for a long time. They're meant to absorb. And then there's the infill, which is the active element, one that occurs on a more temporal scale that perhaps, it doesn't necessarily have to be a literal infill, but if you buy into it, a kind of conceptual one, and I think that through that notion of the different temporalities in building, that we really found a way into this question of how to work through these different modalities of scarcity, through this kind of open-ended nature of practice, in which perhaps, we begin to think through building components, delaminating them into their individual parts, being critical about what elements we were designed to be disassembled, whereas those that were designed to kind of withstand time, and our work is very interested in that kind of that binary or that relationship, the dichotomy between these two modes or temporalities of operating. And a work like this from Raumlabor, a German practice in Berlin, is to us very inspiring because this is Habraken in 2006 to us. It's a highway structure, and probably the most ugly, undesirable urban space within the city, and yet something as light, thin, and fragile as a pneumatic bubble is capable of producing new meaning and new space within it. And so that exactly that relationship between spaces that are available for appropriation and that infill that manages to produce new meaning within it is really, I think, where we would like to kind of situate our work and begin to discuss it as a kind of open-ended structure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're, like Lara was saying, interested in this kind of open-endedness that comes both from the kind of sequence of crises that we've experienced as students, then the pandemic a couple of years ago, and how that kind of informs an attitude towards architecture and the built environment. So how we understand things in this context of scarcity and of necessarily smaller projects is through kind of something that is already there, a frame that we inhabit, kind of what Ronnie Roberts calls the tabula plena. So understanding that we're operating within a very complex set of relationships that is already there, where we come up, or we try to come up in assembling this talk with a series of kind of new operative verbs or new ways of understanding how we kind of inscribe our work within something that is already there. We do this in our work, we do this in our teaching as well, which is a really important component of our practice. And so that kind of open-endedness for us is halfway between kind of affordability and the way in which we have been forced or encouraged to think about how can we develop architecture with less resources, and adaptation. In this case, adaptation to a kind of, let's say, increasingly extreme weather events that we really as architects have to respond to. talking about our practice a little bit, our practice kind of thrives in that scarcity, I would say, or thrives in that kind of lack of resources on the one hand, but on the other hand, kind of the digital means, right? So the pandemic also brought a kind of universalization of home office, right, and working from home. And as practitioners, we really formulated our practice as this thing that really, like, we don't have an office space. The stuff we do is much more like bedroom pop, like, you know, the music genre, like bedroom architecture. We work from our bedrooms, which also I think makes practice very accessible. It makes, you know, young architects and students kind of understand that with the means and methods that we have today, you can really go really far. Our practice looks much more like this, like a kind of WhatsApp thread, an archive of images that come back and forward of unfinished kind of fragments that also kind of ultimately define the work, right? And also of references, right? So like we kind of have this cloud or bubble of references, of ideas, of sketches. And then another thing is that our practice, we define it as a collaborative practice. And maybe I wanted to stop for a second and ask, like, have you watched The Brutalist or The Fountainhead or read The Fountainhead? So like, some people. So the kind of modality of practice portrayed maybe is unrelatable for some of you, for us, for sure. You know, this idea of the struggle of one individual trying to wait for that wonderful client to understand their genius and then build the work. For us, practice is much more about a cloud or a network of collaboration where we kind of share and pool resources with, you know, sometimes within the discipline with architects, sometimes in more cross-disciplinary terms, and that allows us to be in many different places at the same time, working in kind of different scales, in different, you know, continents, through different methods, and also approach a very kind of eclectic set of projects.
Great. So I'm going to start by explaining this journey of the project of the greenhouse for plants and humans in El Carmen, Peru, by describing how this project is really something that you find at the end of this travel between the capital city of Lima in Peru and El Carmen in the province of Ica. And it happens as a kind of journey through the desert, the Peruvian deserts, coming across a number of kind of unsteady and fragile, perhaps roadside vernacular structures that have to do with the maintenance of trucks. And so it's somehow that trip down the Panamericana Sur begins to reveal a kind of vernacular which is of special interest to us, that of the alar. The alar is a kind of add-on to an interior, something that in many cases is light and unsteady, but presents a space that is available as an extension of the home to the street, a kind of public intermediate room, if you will, that is understood as a kind of add-on. And that kind of process of looking and noticing and collaging those, you know, vernaculars to us is a kind of parallel exercise to something that someone like Ed Ruscha might be interested in, the looking and noticing of the ordinary, to elevate it into something that might be quite extraordinary, in fact. And so finally, we arrive at this valley, quite a fertile agricultural valley, supplied by a river that descends from the Andes and kind of formed through a series of canals that extend from the river and start to produce these incredibly elongated agricultural tracts. And so this area is where the project is situated in El Carmen. is a region under transition. If there was a kind of geographic transformation between the space of the desert and then the encounter of the fertile agricultural valley, now on a kind of time-based transition, we're looking at a switch or a kind of shift from an primarily agricultural use into a space that is ever increasingly more under the pressure of development into a residential area, even being 3 hours from Lima, somehow still under the pressure of the horizontal expansion of the metropolis. And so this space, the project is a greenhouse for plants and humans, and it's called that because it's a space that is designed for the care of plants, but it also acknowledges the kind of the symbiotic relationship that can be established of mutual care between the caretakers, the humans that care for these plants, and the way that plants care in return for them through food. And so that kind of parallel expresses itself in these two adjacent bodies of the building, and uses that typology of the alab as a way to propose or offer a kind of indeterminate semi-exterior space that is actually a living room for people, and the interior, which is a kind of inversion of the typical an interior for plants. And in that kind of adjacency, we imagine a number of different configurations that could possibly unfold, kind of thinking through the possibilities of what this space could become, given enough time, given the opportunity for misuse. And so when we received this image, we were delighted because the inhabitants of the greenhouse are completely misusing it, setting up camp there, and a kind of impromptu picnic table completely outside of what we had imagined that the space would look like on a daily basis. But somehow it feels very appropriate to the way that we understood the potentials or the ambitions of the project. And the project also has a material story. In this region, there is quite a lot of brick kilns. It's kind of part of a constructive tradition in this area. This image is not one of ours, but one that exemplifies the brick kilns nearby. And in the process of making bricks, there are often several that, due to their closeness to the fire, get overburned and are not usable. This is called, in this region, it's called rococho, which means overcooked. And it's a kind of clinker brick that has suffered deformations, is no longer structural, and it's definitely undesirable for many that are engaged in construction. And so it's often a cheaper material, it's often discarded in a yard, and we collected it to form the kind of monolithic base of the floors and the walls of the greenhouse. And then the other parts of this construction, being that it has such a small scale, the contractor was able to supply most of the materials as offcuts from a much larger agricultural project in the vicinity. And so in a way, we really like the notion, and this became something fundamental for us, that this building is somehow an assemblage of things that were unwanted, but that come together, and yet there is an architectural project there about producing a kind of atmosphere and producing a kind of routine, and anticipating anticipating or the lack of anticipating of the future and how it might unfold in its structure.
Yeah, you'll see how there's a lot of ongoing threads and things or elements or anchor points that we think I'm really interested about that kind of stay with us. And what we're showing are a series of chronologically ordered projects. And you'll see how we had takeaways from projects that we continue to pursue. Of course, this idea of open-endedness kind of is parallel to all of them. And so, but what was wonderful to us is that we had the chance to work at a very similar scale in a super, super small project, which is around 100 square meters in Peru, and then at the same time in Korea, the exact same size, completely different context. But we really wanted to kind of, again, pursue this idea of an unfinished open frame that the users would kind of complete and activate and take agency over. So when we're invited to the Sol Biennale of Architecture and Urbanism together with our friend and collaborator and mentor, Frank Barkow, the topic was land architecture, land urbanism. The posters kind of really clearly show that idea that land understands and watches us as much as we understand and exist above land and landscape. And so we really wanted to kind of understand how the site in which we were going to operate had changed and evolved over time. The site, the site was kind of part of a urban void that was within or embodied within the former Eastern Palace that you can see on the image on the left. And now only two parts of that palace remain that we left here in color. The rest is this kind of super highly developed business district. And then this void in the center, right? So we were always intrigued about the character of the void. In parallel, we were also, kind of like Laura was showing before, trying to understand traditional or vernacular typologies, in this case, the courtyard typology, right? Which is both present in the palaces, as you can see on the left, this kind of map building as a sequence of courtyards, and then the hanok, the traditional courtyard typology, house, small-scale courtyard typology, where the courtyard is also a kind of productive space used as we were informed and as we learned to kind of store the kimchi vases. So we were kind of really intrigued by that scale of the courtyard as a space that we wanted to kind of reenact or think around as a public space, as a kind of inherently public space. And then the other thing that was very instrumental at the beginning was understanding this kind of language of the walls as filters that we found on Google Street View trip site visit that we couldn't travel to Seoul when we were starting this project. And we were kind of really intrigued about that condition that was present throughout the 20th century when the site was military, occupied by the military, to then very recently when it became a park, in the image in the right. And we really wanted to kind of explore that condition of the void within the void and think around wall architecture and a wall as a filter that kind of captures and encapsulates a more private within the public or domestic within the public space. We were interested in that tension. So immediately we started fabricating a lot of these paper kind of super fast models looking for a scale, looking to kind of understand what was it exactly that we were trying to do, right? And we don't hide our process, and we actually really enjoy showing it, right? We were exploring something that would be more tectonic and soft, or something that would look more like a solar panel, or something that could look like a series of offcuts, again, of material kind of offcuts from like quarry or industrial processes, something more topographical. And then in the end, we decided, okay, let's go and start a conversation around material. Let's take the easiest kind of shape, the square with the open corners, and then like in our prior project, kind of allow the material to come in and inform the project. So right at that time, we were talking to the director of the Biennale, and she was like, well, why don't we wanted to reuse material, right? And come up with a low carbon strategy. So she proposed, she was telling us, I have a very similar pavilion that is coming down 2 weeks before, a very similar scale, 2 weeks before the Biennale. Why don't we just store the material find a way to incorporate it into the project and reuse it, right? So we were like, okay, let's try to find a way to do it because, material reuse is very tricky. It's something very easy to say, but then when you actually want to do it, you have to figure out the actual dimensions. How do they fit? Are they damaged or not? Where do you store them until you redeploy them? But we figured a way in which we could come up with a structural grid with a base structure, also for this kind of chimney element, where we would reuse almost like 80% of the material from the pavilion. So we were very happy that we could do that. And in parallel, we kind of tried to develop an idea of, how would that interior space look like? So we knew that, sadly, we don't have a picture of that, but the park used to be a forest, and then when they gave it back to the city as a park, the immediate response was just like blocked. And somehow we wanted to use this project as a vessel that would contain a garden of traditional or native plants, that once the pavilion was dismantled, the plants would stay there and would kind of like start generating again a kind of more nuanced garden for the citizens to enjoy. We were also involved in the construction process, in the gardening process. We could travel there and really started kind of experimenting some of these fascinating scenes of people inhabiting and having super, extremely intimate experiences inside that box with all these typical skyscrapers behind us and the kind of frantic activity of the city. So by being there in the construction process, we already started to test, if that makes sense, how the building would behave or would be received by the public. And then all of these kind of safe spaces were for us, again, a moment where we could see the public starting to build curiosity and access and enter and experience the building in different ways. This round window as a kind of photo or social media moment that everybody was enjoying a lot. And then we stayed there for a number of days. These are photos that we took, and we started kind of understanding how such a kind of weird artifact that looks like it landed in the middle of the city starts getting activated and understood, maybe because of its kind of sheer scale or simplicity or affinity of material by the citizens. And we kind of really enjoyed that. And then of course this was also a kind of commentary in these temporal events like biennales, festivals, and so on, which I think are moving towards a kind of a model that is more aware of their carbon footprint. And so our idea was that the pavilion would disappear after 2 months, that the carbon footprint would be very low, but that there would be an imprint on the site with this kind of garden of native plants that would stay there.
And the project was acquired by...
Oh yes, and then we also managed to kind of sell the project. So that really kind of tapped into that story of circularity and allowed the project to have multiple lives. And so now it's on its third iteration, we guess. At the same time, we managed to get to the final of a competition that was super exciting for us, with this very similar kind of public space activators, similar scale. But in this case, in a kind of derelict or disrepaired central area in a city in Spain, a small city in Spain called Logroño. And so Logroño hosts annually a festival of ephemeral architectures that kind of prompts citizens to participate and kind of understand how through these artifacts they can think of public space in a different way and activate public space in a different way, right? Like beyond the stores, beyond the bars, how can we kind of start to understand how we share the public space together? So what was really cool and thought-provoking about the competition for us was that they were asking us to send a letter saying, what would you do if instead of just doing a pavilion, you can propose a series of measures and activities and projects that would change the life of the city within 10 years. And we were really reminded of this kind of very active letter that Soledad sent kind of saying, just do, just do things, don't be so, don't take so much time thinking around and just act. And so we were really kind of trying to have this attitude in our letter as well, of saying, look, like there's a lot of things that you can start doing. The first one is just not building anything, but setting up a calendar of events in which you can ask the citizens in a much more direct way, how do they imagine public space in the city to evolve over time, over a period of 10 years. We developed the project as more an unconventional competition. We've done a lot of competitions, but we never did a competition like this before that is kind of more of a timeline that starts with a series of events. And then there are a number of architectural devices that are, again, very small scale, open-ended, that deploy kind of reused materials, and that we'll explain in a second. The first one was kind of, again, looking at a vernacular typology that is not used anymore and trying to think around it and, how did it work? Why was it so popular? In this case, kiosk in the 19th and early 20th century. The kiosk is right here. As a structure that was kind of totally open for appropriation with no specific use and was extremely popular pre-tourism when people would just, hang out in the public space in their cities, play concerts and dance and have festivals. And so we really wanted to understand that scale and how it used to be implemented in public space and re-implemented. So the first architectural device that we proposed in that kind of long-year strategy was to re-implement the kiosk as a place in which citizens would really portray the type of city that they were imagining. And the type of city in Spain, given that this project is in Spain, is very, tumultuous and festive. And we immediately also started to explore ways in which we could represent this through drawing, not just a kind of rendering without people or drawing without people, but really this kind of drawing where the people, the citizens are occupying and activating and using these public devices. And really the first one acts as an anchor and attracts people, right? And then a lot of other similar scale objects start to appear and kind of blend and blur into the ground floor of the city.
And so the question was, what are these devices anyway? And how we found our way into this is thinking about Concéntrico and the festival. As Pablo mentioned, many of these types of festivals, biennial festivals, are thinking now of ways to make those ephemeral structures participate in more circular ways. So what we were proposing to do was to take the festival of Concéntrico as a kind of quarry of material, to reuse parts of pavilions that have been constructed in previous years, and through a kind of a methodology of adapting those components in a way that perhaps reconfigure their function but maintain some DNA of what they had been at some point, could be the basis of these objects that we would propose to design. And the notion is not that we would necessarily fill up the street from day one with these devices, but our proposal for the competition wanted to put out there as an image was an image of a possibility, a way of kind of projecting into the future through modes of representation, to imagine a kind of plethora or the kind of maximal state of what a certain resolution of this project might be, and yet always considering that these kinds of works and the production of those devices would have to emerge from the needs and from the community itself, and that as architects, we would operate in a way as facilitators, as a kind of intermediary designer of parts that pre-existed our work, of needs emerging from neighbors, and kind of helping them to rethink and reconfigure what those devices populating the street might be. But we're not just talking about the street as per se in Logroño. We also in the area of the project, identified that this space, the reason why it's an urban space that doesn't work is because in terms of time, there's a specific temporality to it, which is actually that of nightlife. There are a number of discotheques and clubs and kind of night-driven activities that make it such that the spaces during the day are extremely unsuccessful, and therefore leads to quite a few kind of vacant spaces, vacant storefronts that are either for sale or abandoned or for rent. And so that was a big component of our proposal, imagining ways in which those devices could begin to activate those locales, always on a kind of scale perhaps of hours or days or weeks, but as a kind of take on the pop-up, and how at the end fundamentally, how can citizens realize that the street is a public space that they have agency over, and that those spaces are ones that can be occupied by the people that live in those cities, and that there might be means to meet each other in everyday, more kind of isolated and like digital world, that there might be more moments to actually find each other as a community through a series of activities.
And this is also maybe not a new idea. Of course, we learned from people like Jane Jacobs in understanding that in order for public activities, in order for the streets to work, you need to have that kind of public life. Right? You need to have that kind of inherently open-ended streetscape that invites people to participate, normally through a kind of a series of urban artifacts that we try to identify and redeploy. And also because this project comes from an attitude that we developed also after the pandemic, when a lot of restaurants and bars started building these kind of shacks in the street, right? Which is like private space taking over public space in the street, which can happen like this, like super easily. So we were thinking, wait, hold on a second, why can't we think of similar devices that are provided by the city, but that are actually kind of public access, right? That you don't have to kind of have a huge tab or have a meal or sit there or pay in order to enjoy and share with other citizens. And we know that there's a lot of kind of initiatives similarly happening, not so much in Spain. So this is something that really drove this project, right? All the way from like a summer kind of projection, a cinema, to a flower shop, to outdoor sports, etc. Something really interesting that happened, and that really collegial, was that we didn't win the competition, although we got the second prize and we got a commission from it, which we are developing now together with the festival. But the winner read our proposal and said, hey, why don't we invite them, because we were proposing very similar things, and start that kind of conversation. So if you remember what we were saying at the beginning, that we were proposing a series of events and kind of participatory assemblies with the citizens. They thought, the winner thought, and the organizers of the festival thought, why don't we invite them? And it was really actually incredible for us. It was an experience where we could really see our project live, like participate in those events, radio shows, conversations, performances, and start asking the citizens what would they do and how would they imagine the city within 10 years. The answers are like, completely a wide spectrum, but really kind of informative and helpful to get.
And so this project is a bit closer to home. This project, Animals, is located in Syracuse, New York. And it's a series of installations of devices that you see here in this kind of broad green. But they occupy this warehouse. This is the Gear block. It's historic warehouse built along the Erie Canal. And for those of you who are not so familiar with the history of central New York, the Erie Canal was a really important waterway that connected Albany and the Hudson River to the kind of Great Lakes, running through cities like Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, and so on. And it's a piece of infrastructure that had incredible economic impact within its area of influence. And right here, you see the line of the Erie Canal, and then this is the location of the warehouse project that we did. But what has happened to it since those kind of golden years is that the kind of automotive industry and the highways that run all over the United States replaced this piece of infrastructure, and therefore it became obsolescent. And many of the buildings along its path have somehow become underutilized or vacant. This one for sure has a really interesting history, a kind of palimpsest of stories, where it had been at some point a fire truck manufacturing plant and a paint factory, and a few other lives that it's gone through. But always within the building, there are these kind of cycles of reconfiguration of its form to satisfy just the kind of very direct need from the uses within it. And so the building had lied vacant for quite a few years until this woman came along, Eve DeRosa, and she bought the building during the pandemic, thinking of its potential to become a community center, a place to host creative businesses and community-oriented activities. And so her vision for this building is one that kind of connects to its immediate neighborhood and to its region, and perhaps has a role in kind of reconciling that like post-industrial past. And so hearing that from her, we were incredibly inspired, and of course this is very much a project that is close to our hearts. I should note that it's very important to know that it's a project that we did in a collaborative way with other young faculty at Syracuse University, and you'll see them in a second. But our idea here, what we propose to Eve, is to take something like this, which is a series of modular steel shelves that were left over from the time this was a warehouse for the paint from Strathmore Paint, to produce an inventory of them as a series of kind of resources or materials that could be appropriated, and then to imagine a series of configurable devices or artifacts that have the capacity to activate the spaces within that very building, anticipating a architectural project with change of use and a series of kind of legal procedures associated to it. How could we kind of cheaply and immediately begin to offer a way that the spaces within the building could be activated and used? How could we bring attention to the building itself and its potential within a community, and in a way through these works kind of introduce it to a broader audience. The project has also became somehow about the tectonics of reconfiguring those shelving units and turning them into a series of different objects. This, for example, is a column light, kind of working in conjunction with other supplementary columns that had been introduced changed into the space over the years, needed to hold up the building as it kind of fluctuated under different loads. So while this is not structural, it somehow relates to the condition. And other objects such as this, which is a kind of dividing wall that was able to make out of large spaces within the building a kind of smaller subset of rooms, or a stage that had a more performative ambition to it, thinking of the building and spaces within the building kind of enabled for performances for active use, different devices on wheels as a way to rethink the kinds of activities that could occur within it. And yeah, this is the group of people that did this project. It's Pablo and myself, Edgar Rodriguez, Lawrence Scott, Aisha Ghosh, Magdalena Valdebenito, and Rocio Croceto Panbarza. And so this project also, due to its really quick nature, it was also a design build project, meaning that we literally built it ourselves. We dismantled the shelves, cleaned them, painted them, and reassembled them ourselves. And then, as we were working in the warehouse, had an opportunity to meet with many kind of passersby that ultimately became part of an opening and a series of tours through the building, in which I think that we were able to present our project, but more than just presenting our project, we're presenting the building and perhaps the typology of the building. Perhaps this building is understood as a case study for how these spaces that are somehow forgotten and therefore associated to a kind of a series of cultural implications related to their image and their history, how those could perhaps change their meaning within the eyes of the neighbors around it. Change the meaning not as a kind of image of light, but perhaps one that was looking towards the future. And as we were working on this project, we were also really interested in discussing how other projects of representation might begin to operate within this kind of work. And I think we're huge fans of Gordon Matta Clark, of course, and his project of splitting is fascinating because he not only modifies a building in New Jersey by introducing this weird kind of slit through its center, but it's also a project of representation in the way that the image that reproduces the interior reconfigures or reinterprets the possible meanings and the possible ways of reading the value of what would otherwise be a kind of generic series of rooms. And so we ended up, as a kind of part of this project, we ended up proposing a grant exhibition, or an exhibition that we won a grant for from NISTA and the Architectural League to engage in a representational project of the building itself, thinking through perhaps a kind of approach as Matta Clark might, the moments that expose layers of history where perhaps we're talking about a generic structure. It's not one that needs to really consider matters of historic preservation, but that there are moments of expansion within its own frame and its own form that expose the necessity to change a kind of structural aspect of its organization, and therefore exposes the kind of need of a building to transmute itself over time. And what what we're really kind of proposing as an idea is that anything new that occurs within a historic structure only needs to be another level or another layer to that history, and that buildings can indeed continue to evolve, and it's about establishing a kind of dialogue with what was already there, anticipating that things will continue to adapt and will continue to change over time.
And one last project, and actually a new one that we just received these photographs, so we're very excited with them, with how they turned out, and happy to show them today. This is a project that we've been able to do together with our institutions, Pratt and Syracuse and Tulane, and with our friends from Lima, Peru. And it's a kind of public device, a kind of weird artifact project as part of the Ibero-American Biennale that took place in December in Lima, Peru. For those of you who maybe are not so familiar with these types of events, the most famous one is the Venice Biennale, right? This is going to happen in May. And they are normally a kind of very disciplinary meeting where like a bunch of architects meet and you know, they don't really kind of communicate so well to the citizens, at least in our opinion, or don't kind of translate the urgency of the topics. But both in the Seoul Biennale and in the Ibero-American Biennale, I think what we've observed is that there's a change of attitude in kind of trying to get the public, the general public, more involved through these public installations that are quite deliberately in the middle of public space and kind of inviting people to be curious, to participate, to be critical, if you may. And so this Biennale was called Climas, and what they were, you know, again, kind of proposing is this urgent question of how do we adapt to a climate that is, you know, more and more challenging in some latitudes to live within, right? Especially for sure in Lima, also in the south of Spain, where we do a lot of work. So the organizers of the Biennale came up with a really cool idea to get people to participate, which was the act of the sobremesa. So the sobremesa is kind of in Latin culture, whatever happens after the meal. So the meal is not so important as just, you know, hanging around and sharing time and a discussion and a conversation with whoever you're sharing a meal with. And that normally takes up, you know, as much time, if not more, as the meal itself. So they were thinking, why don't we gather, you know, with scholars, architects, and with citizens around the table and discuss, you know, what are the urgent topics that the city needs to think about. In that process, they not only engaged us, but they also engaged the Red de Ollas Comunes, which is a community kitchen that kind of became, especially they've always been there doing a kind of extremely, you know, proliferous labor of providing food in food desert, providing food security in informal human settlements in Lima, Peru, and in the surrounding area of Lima, Peru. It's led by women primarily. And during the pandemic, they had a kind of key role, and some new associations started to appear. So they had a big voice in this Biennale, and we had the privilege to work with one of the Ollas Comunes, with the Ollas Comunes in Comas. So one of the kind of neighborhoods in the surrounding area of Lima. So when we were invited to do this project, the first thing that we were told by both Ollas Comunes and the organizers was like, hey, we need these kind of tables that also need to provide shade, that could also be transformed for hydroponics in the future. They need to be modular and they should be easy to build and easy to disassemble. And so with all of these things, again, we went to the kind of roadside vernacular and these kind of temporary agricultural constructions that are deployed, serve a purpose for a while, and then are dismantled and transported somewhere else. And we like this kind of simple tectonics and lightness that also speak to like a very easy way of building them and sourcing materials. So immediately we kind of started to develop a table that had awnings that would be easy to open, easy to fold, easy to close, easy to build, easy to kind of array as a kind of super long table, which is how it was mounted or installed for the Biennale itself. And then kind of figure out a way in which we could, again, pursue this very, this thing that we've always been interested in, of kind of using low cost, off the shelf, available materials. So we managed to work with a local furniture factory, a very small one, and to also work with Tomillo, which is a kind of local Amazonic timber type of wood. And also to then kind of deploy these low-cost awnings that are kind of like the awnings that you use to cover boats, right? And these very kind of durable tarp systems. We worked with Nevenka and Rufo and Barbara, I think, in a kind of, again, very familiar, very domestic, very close way of working that allowed us to have kind of very fine resolution in the details and a very kind of specific way of constructing these defamiliarized tables, if you may. And then we were also there for the inauguration and got to see how this table was kind of deployed in, again, a kind of disrepaired, underutilized public space in the middle of Comas for a community lunch led by the Ollas Comunes community kitchen. So, you can see how it starts relating to its context. And again, we like to work closely with other disciplines, like in this case, the photographer Ivan Salinero, who came up with this idea of referencing the Thomas Struth photographies of Lima. I don't know if you've seen them, but this kind of idea of reflecting on the color and starting to create kind of tension and reciprocity between what is there and the piece that we installed. Then the series of events started to happen. Sometimes we had these kind of community gatherings, sobremesas. In other occasions we had everybody looking towards the stage that was also installed. So again, the misuse of the table started to happen, and it kind of became this sort of like bleachers with a shade. Also, we learned about we knew about it, but we had never thought of this parallelism with the ice cream cart, which is always yellow in Lima, and it's always this kind of like mobile, strange artifact that appears in public spaces and creates a different condition to what was there before. And we really love this picture. And then again, the kind of soft wall or soft boundary effect that it generates when it's closed. I guess everybody can see the modularity, but once the event was over, again, the Biennale was over and we didn't generate any waste at all. All of these modules were donated again to the kind of several community kitchens. So we wanted to maybe end with this slide, and maybe Laura can add something as well. But this kind of going back to all of the things that we were talking about before, our architecture wants to think of itself, or we want to see it, and hopefully convince you of seeing it as well, like that, as something that is open-ended, as the title of the lecture, but also affordable, low cost, easy to build, easy to recirculate, and especially, and I think these images show it well, kind of through maybe that small scale, much more or generating a new relationship to its context, as in some of the projects that Laura was mentioning before. So in a way, we want to kind of talk about and are interested and invested in practice, and I think a lot of practitioners that are working in parallel with us in this architecture that is kind of much more aware of its context and becomes a part of it over time. Thank you.
Because we're just in 300, we can probably raise our hands and ask questions. Yeah. There's good one, but every week try to project.
Could you all hear us well? More or less? Okay, thank you.
I guess
work in this smaller scale operates as a kind of field. If I were to go back to that diagram, the Habarka diagram, more. If we were working in a larger scale, I think we would be interested in refining and working through in a more intentional manner the design of the support itself.
Yeah, and in a way, like we're super inspired by projects like the Palais de Tokyo by Lacaton and Basal, if you all know that project. In a way, that to us, in terms of the intervention, like Laura was saying, is also kind of a small scale project, right? Very small inscriptions, kind of grafting onto what is there. But you know, this let's say the size of it is pretty large, but the scale of the intervention is super small. So if we could choose the type of work that we do, which is maybe not the case, we would pursue that type of work, the kind of small scale but maybe larger impact.
In the project, the street in 10 years, where you kind of use like the void of like an unused, currently unused typology, or like a forgotten typology, is I feel like there's sort of like a nostalgia or like a somatic nostalgia, like a physical just like familiarity, like trying to be provoked from the people, like the people there. That have like forgotten that typology. And is that like nostalgia or familiarity, is that a goal or is that more just like a consequence of something else?
You mean, I think the kiosk, right?
Yeah.
The kind of reproducing the kiosk. Yeah, I don't think that our interpretation of it is nostalgic necessarily, but perhaps it's understood as a device that does relate to social memory and to a cultural way of relating to each other on the street between citizens, and essentially trying to find how architecture can truly participate in the design or the production of a space that appears in a public context and that motivates a certain way of behaving. Not that we would kind of script what would need to occur there, but that it is identifiable enough as a typology, as you said, that could motivate it to be used in a communal way as a kind of social condenser.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's super difficult to answer fast. Like we need to have a conversation later. And you know, nostalgia is a term that is kind of difficult to define how you feel about it, especially in terms of kind of design and approach to history and culture and looking at the vernacular and the traditional, right? But we try to, I don't know if we convince, but we try to not romanticize these typologies and look at kind of history as something that is like, oh, that was better, let's redeploy that again. But kind of understand or analyze what was it that worked about it, and extract those elements in a more abstract way and try to redeploy them. But we do try to have a certain kind of degree of abstraction in the way in which we learn from or take those elements, right, and redeploy them. Whether it's more or less, whether it feels more or less nostalgic.
Sorry. Building on the answer you just mentioned, is there a continuous theme in all the projects that pushes this idea of constructing walls? Because, for example, I mean, many architects, as a matter of fact, probably most architects work with history for this place, but they all have their own focus on maybe some of the particular things. For example, two architects pop in mind, Carlos Garba, who he himself is more about this tectonic feature of architecture that shows the timelessness of Ely culture, and for Peter Luther, another example, it is more or less this experiential level of things that he cared more about. So is there a continuous theme for you guys, or does it depend on project?
I would say since we're, and probably you will notice that, references and precedents are super important for us and for our work, and I think it's kind of central to practice in general. Maybe the precedents or the way in which we relate to history or to what is already there is more connected to the work that Allison and Peter Smithson were doing, for example, in the way that it's much more looking at the ordinary, what you will find immediately as you put a step on the street. And I think that is kind of at odds or kind of in contrast to maybe what the other person was asking before, this idea of kind of nostalgia or romanticizing something that maybe even wasn't the case, like Rome or Rome, the Greek culture, Greek architecture, as some architects that you're mentioning, kind of framing their work. But for us, that idea of the ordinary, of the everyday, that is connected to the human scale and to maybe the immaterial, is something that informs deeply our work.
I thought it was really quite beautiful how basically you had a community in itself. You had something that was beautiful in the sense that it was beautiful of light. But what were the challenges that you can't fit into some nice pictures with working with the community? And I'm wondering, with your current projects or with your future projects, how that might change the community if you were in Tallahassee, Florida, for example.
Yeah, great community is different.
I think maybe a quick answer, like the question is like the question, but a quick answer would be that, it's much more complicated in terms of networks, processes, investors, people that you have to engage. So it's not just participating with the community, but actually if you want to get things happening, you kind of have to understand all the way from budgets, kind of really thoroughly, to building code, zoning, change over time, which is something that we've been talking about a lot. So that often kind of becomes a series of thresholds that we need to go through, and that's one of the things that we've learned most from those kind of the events, the photos of the events that we show. We understand that we can be very wishful, right? But then there's a lot of different processes that need to start after you get all the answers of how people imagine their city on a piece of paper. And that's kind of one of the things that we're doing now.
Yeah, I think the agency of representation is a really powerful tool that we have as architects. And it's somehow part of our work to produce an image of something that is projective, meaning that it hasn't yet occurred but could happen, and use that as perhaps not what will be ultimately the end product, but what will guide a kind of conversation around a series of rules or values. And actually, when you mentioned Florida, we have worked on a project in southern Florida with a community that confronts issues of coastal resilience, meaning that in a few years their community is going to be flooded. The role of models and images and drawings in landing a kind of reality that you may not want to confront on your daily, like in your day-to-day, has a kind of critical role in establishing a kind of opening set of lines for that conversation.
Yeah, that's a great point. What Laura is mentioning in Florida, since you did mention Florida, is a studio that we did. It's called Platform Surfside. It's in Florida. but we can tell you later. And that became an exhibition, and it kind of showed us, there's a lot of, sometimes architects propose things and there's a lot of pushback from the community, right? So that's one of the things that doesn't fit or doesn't appear in the photographs that we're showing today. But there's a lot of kind of different forces operating in these discussions that we can also talk about later. We can't just like give a short answer. So that's a great question.
Yes, you and then
Thank you for your lecture. I really appreciate it. It brings me joy and a little bit of hope for the future. I'm curious, you were talking a lot about materiality and then how you were reusing materials. I'm curious, I can tell in some of the projects that material definitely comes first when you're designing from them, but in something like maybe the greenhouse or the things, when you have some sort of form or program or idea first, at what point do these discarded materials come in and do you have the special materials that you're using to then make the drawings with, or the drawings in first and you can change things? So it seems so complicated. It's just it's very
yeah, that's the beauty of the kind of collaborative process of architecture, that it's slow, and in its production there's a series of conversations of how things will literally come together, and a piece is never determined, right? I think that is a kind of really critical lesson, that there is only so much that we have defined in stone before you engaging in a kind of project of possibility, especially if it's one that needs to be realized, right? And so material really does play a role, because the ambition is for it to be kind of constructed, and that construction and its realization is about engaging in those conversations. So specifically when the material, like when the Rococho brick and the offsets from the other, the larger brick house, when they came into the design of our project, I don't really remember, honestly. But I think that maybe it started from a desire to look at the kind of vernacular, because there was an interest in understanding the local possibilities of construction. If you look and observe carefully enough the things in the vicinity that have been made, then that is a good indication of the things you can make too. And that is why that kind of process of kind of photographing and cataloging and kind of reformatting those vernacular architectures, that was important to us. I don't think that is really nostalgic. That's really more like wanting to assert a realm of possibility for what that project could be. And so it was encouraging to know that there were, and inspiring to see these kind of steel structures next to the highway. And it was inspiring to notice that there was a lot of brick production in that area. And then slowly things kind of come together like that.
Yeah, but there is a constant back and forth between material, the kind of reframing of the typology, and then the overarching tension of the low budgets. So like all of these three things at the same time are what kind of define. But there's never a prescribed path. Sometimes it starts with the massing, and then at some point with the typology, and then the material kicks in. In other projects that we showed, I think it's more clear, like driven by the reassembly of parts.
Yeah.
This will have to be the last question, just as there is a class coming up in the room. But we have time for one more.
Regarding the final project, the modular seating area, with the shade sails were let down to which embedded form, the sort of soft partition. I was curious where that concept originates from, if you could explain it a little bit.
I think it has to do with the Animals project, with the one in the Syracuse warehouse. And again, in general, with architects like Antonio Basal, who estrange or change or reconfigure elements within architecture like a wall, right? And again, it's not a new idea. Like in modernist architecture, there's also like wonderful examples of like walls on wheels, which always we ultimately complain about because they don't really work so well. But the kind of idea here was to change or again break the scale of a scaleless place, right? Like this kind of old, derelict, public, made out of concrete space with a softer diagonal. That diagonal was intentional also because it kind of generates a tension and a tension, and the citizens immediately recognize it as well. It's really funny. Everyone was asking us, why do you put it like this? What are you? But you could see how like animals started to gather, like dogs. There's a lot of dogs in this neighborhood. Dogs started to gather in one place. Like people were playing soccer on one side, then at the other side we were having this kind of like open conversation, open mic discussion. So it really became that kind of sort of partition that allowed for all of these activities to happen at the same time. Now this is maybe a kind of narrative device. Maybe those activities happen anyway, but somehow we implement the wall, or the soft wall, or the table, or however we want to call it, the sobremesa, and it produces some sort of change in the scale, right? It kind of becomes this open air piece of furniture. The citizens immediately understand and appropriate. I don't know if you noticed in the photograph, there's like a round opening at the bottom of the table. So the dogs were using it as a kind of workout area, kind of circulating underneath. So we just implemented it there as this kind of soft boundary, and then all of these beautiful things started to happen.